To truly grasp why surviving even a single day in medieval times was such a monumental challenge, you have to understand the grim realities of medieval hygiene. In today's world, we take clean water, toilets, and regular bathing for granted. But in medieval Europe, these basic necessities were luxuries few could afford. Public sanitation was virtually non-existent. People lived crammed together in tiny, overcrowded homes made of wood and wattle, often sharing their living space with animals like pigs, chickens, or goats. This close proximity created a perfect storm for the spread of disease. Waste disposal was one of the greatest problems. Most towns didn't have sewers. Instead, human waste was simply thrown into the streets or into nearby rivers and streams. Rivers were not only the source of drinking water, but also the dumping grounds for excrement and waste from tanneries, slaughterhouses, and other smelly trades. Imagine drinking from a river teeming with raw sewage and the rotting remains of animals. The likelihood of contracting waterborne diseases like dysentery or cholera was extraordinarily high. Bathing was infrequent, especially for peasants. While medieval literature sometimes romanticizes bathhouses, many people went months without washing. Bathhouses existed, but were often viewed with suspicion by the church and seen as places of moral decay. Moreover, bathing too often was thought to open the pores and invite disease. The concept of germs was unknown. Without regular washing, lice, fleas, and other parasites thrived, spreading typhus and other infections. And then there was the plague, the Black Death, that swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The disease was terrifying not only because of its deadly speed, but because people didn't understand how it spread. Rats and fleas were the real culprits, but superstition blamed everything from bad air to divine punishment. Entire villages were wiped out in days, bodies piling up in the streets, or hastily buried in mass graves. If you woke up one morning to neighbors mysteriously disappearing or dying, you might be next. Medical knowledge was rudimentary and often harmful. Doctors used a combination of herbal remedies, prayers, and bizarre treatments like bloodletting to balance humors in the body. Surgery was primitive and dangerous, often performed without anesthesia or sterilization. Even a simple cut could become infected, leading to gangrene and death. There was no effective way to treat infections, and antibiotics were centuries away. If disease and poor hygiene weren't enough to threaten your life, famine was another ever-present menace. The medieval diet for peasants was monotonous and lacked essential nutrients. They relied heavily on grains like rye and barley, supplemented by vegetables and occasionally cheese or eggs. Meat was a rare luxury for the lower classes, mostly reserved for special occasions. Winters were harsh and long, and if crops failed due to bad weather, insects, or soil exhaustion, starvation followed swiftly. People weakened by hunger were even more susceptible to disease. The physical toll of daily life was brutal. Most people worked from dawn till dusk doing hard manual labor plowing fields, harvesting crops, or maintaining estates. Their tools were primitive and inefficient, making work exhausting and often dangerous. Injuries were common, and without proper care, they frequently turned fatal. Then, there was the constant threat of violence. The medieval period was marked by frequent wars, territorial disputes, and internal conflicts. If you lived near a castle or on contested land, raids, sieges, or battles could erupt with little warning. Bandits roamed rural roads, preying on travelers and merchants. Justice was harsh and public, with brutal punishments like hanging, burning, or mutilation meted out for even minor offenses. You had to be constantly vigilant just to stay alive. Mentally and emotionally, the constant exposure to death, disease, and violence would weigh heavily on anyone. Fear, superstition, and religious fervor shaped people's worldview. Many believed that misfortune was a punishment from God, which bred fatalism and despair. Daily prayers and rituals were attempts to seek protection, but the uncertainty of survival was ever present. In the coming sections, we'll explore these themes further with detailed examples, stories from historical records, and insights into the mindset of medieval people. We'll discover why modern conveniences we take for granted, clean water, sanitation, vaccines, and social order were the difference between life and death. And as we journey deeper, you'll see that surviving 24 hours in medieval times was not just about luck. It was about enduring a relentless barrage of threats that modern humans rarely face. Medieval homes were a far cry from the comfortable, climate-controlled houses we know today. For the vast majority of people, especially peasants and laborers, their dwellings were small, cramped, and built from materials that offered little protection against the elements. Most houses were constructed of wood, wattle, and daub, or sometimes stone in wealthier areas, but insulation was minimal. During harsh winters, cold and dampness seeped through walls and floors, increasing the risk of respiratory illnesses, such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. Fires were a constant danger, as open hearths were the primary source of heat and cooking, and wooden homes were highly flammable. Inside, one or two rooms often served multiple purposes: sleeping, cooking, eating, and even housing animals. Keeping animals inside the home was common because it provided protection from thieves and the cold, but it also contributed to filth, smell, and the spread of parasites. Fleas, lice, and mites thrived in these conditions, spreading diseases like typhus and the plague. Floors were usually packed earth or simple wooden planks, covered with straw or rushes that were rarely cleaned, harboring insects and bacteria. The lack of sanitation facilities is one of the most shocking aspects of medieval life. Toilets, as we know them, were scarce. Many people used chamber pots, which were emptied into the streets or rivers, or simply relieved themselves outside. This waste often flowed freely in the narrow alleys and streets, where children played and animals wandered. Rain could wash the filth into waterways that supplied drinking water, further spreading disease. In some towns, there were rudimentary cesspits or latrines, but their maintenance was inconsistent, and overflow was common. Public bathhouses existed, but were not widespread, and often associated with moral concerns. The church sometimes condemned these establishments as places of vice. Additionally, bathing was believed by some to weaken the body's defenses by opening the pores, which supposedly allowed disease to enter. As a result, many medieval people bathed infrequently, relying instead on dry cleaning methods, such as changing clothes or wiping with cloths. The crowded and unsanitary conditions of medieval towns contributed heavily to disease transmission. Towns were often surrounded by walls for protection, which, while useful against invaders, meant fresh air circulation was limited. Narrow streets crowded with people, animals, and market stalls created a perfect environment for airborne diseases and parasites to spread. The social structure of medieval society played a significant role in determining who had a better chance of survival and who faced the greatest risks. The feudal system established a rigid hierarchy, with kings and nobles at the top, followed by knights, clergy, merchants, artisans, and peasants at the bottom. Wealth and status affected access to resources such as food, clean water, and medical care. Nobles and wealthy merchants often lived in more substantial stone homes or castles, which offered better protection from the elements and disease. They had access to better diets, including meat and imported goods, and could afford servants and medical treatment. However, even they were not immune to the ravages of plague or war. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, faced the harshest realities. They worked the land, paid heavy taxes and rents to their lords, and had little social mobility. Their lives were marked by hard labor, scarcity, and vulnerability. In times of famine or plague, peasants suffered disproportionately. The church was a powerful institution in medieval times, influencing daily life, morality, and health practices. Monasteries were centers of learning and sometimes provided rudimentary medical care, but their treatments were based on limited understanding of disease and often intertwined with religious beliefs. Spiritual healing and prayers were considered essential, sometimes at the expense of practical medicine. Education was limited, mostly reserved for clergy and nobility. The majority of people were illiterate, relying on oral tradition and religious instruction. This lack of knowledge about disease and hygiene perpetuated harmful practices and superstitions. Travel was dangerous, with roads poorly maintained and infested by bandits. Markets and fairs were opportunities for trade, but also for spreading diseases across regions. In this challenging environment, community ties were crucial. Families and villages relied on each other for support during hard times, sharing resources and labor. Festivals and religious holidays provided brief respite from daily struggles, reinforcing social bonds. Yet, despite these coping mechanisms, the medieval world was unforgiving. Harsh winters, poor harvests, plagues, and warfare could devastate communities. Survival depended on a mix of luck, resilience, and social standing. Understanding these conditions helps explain why lasting just 24 hours in medieval times was such a daunting challenge. Every aspect of daily life, from your shelter and sanitation to your social status, directly influenced your chances of survival. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the medical practices of the time, the understanding of disease, and the terrifying treatments that often did more harm than good. Medieval medicine was a world apart from what we know today, shaped by limited scientific knowledge, religious beliefs, and trial-and-error methods. The understanding of the human body was rudimentary, and the causes of diseases were mostly mysterious. This ignorance meant that the treatments available were often ineffective or even harmful, further reducing the chances of survival for anyone who fell ill. The dominant medical theory in medieval Europe was based on the ancient concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. It was believed that an imbalance of these bodily fluids caused illness. Physicians sought to restore balance through various means, primarily bloodletting, purging, and the use of herbal remedies. However, these treatments often weakened patients further. Bloodletting, for instance, was a common practice. It involved drawing blood from a patient to release the excess humors. Physicians used leeches, lancets, or cupping glasses to remove blood. While it might have helped in rare cases, often it left the patient anemic and more vulnerable to infection. Despite its risks, bloodletting remained a staple of medieval medicine for centuries. Herbal medicine was another pillar of treatment. Monks in monasteries preserved knowledge of medicinal plants, and apothecaries sold mixtures to the public. Herbs like willow, a precursor to aspirin, garlic, and chamomile were used to alleviate symptoms. Yet, without precise dosages or understanding of side effects, these remedies were inconsistent in effectiveness. Surgery was crude and dangerous. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, operations were excruciating and frequently fatal due to infection. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, performing tooth extractions, amputations, and wound care. Cauterization, the burning of wounds to stop bleeding, was common. Instruments were unsterilized, and surgical wounds often became infected, leading to sepsis and death. The Black Death devastated medieval society, partly because medical professionals were powerless. Physicians could do little beyond advise isolation, prayers, or superstitious rituals. The plague's rapid progression and deadly nature overwhelmed communities. Entire families, towns, and cities were wiped out. Hospitals were rare and mostly run by religious orders. Their main role was to provide care for the sick and dying, rather than cure. These institutions lacked resources and were overcrowded, further facilitating the spread of disease. Hygiene standards were low, and patients often received basic comfort care and spiritual solace instead of effective medical treatment. Public health knowledge was minimal. The concept of contagious disease was not understood. Quarantine measures were occasionally implemented, but inconsistently, and based more on superstition than science. The term quarantine itself originated from the practice in Venetian ports of isolating ships for 40 days to prevent plague spread, a rare early attempt at controlling disease. Religious beliefs heavily influenced medical practices. Illness was often seen as divine punishment for sins. Confession, prayer, and pilgrimage were common responses to sickness. Pilgrimages to holy sites, such as the Shrine of St. James in Compostela, were believed to bring healing. The Church also discouraged dissection of human bodies, hindering anatomical knowledge. Mental health was poorly understood. Conditions like epilepsy, depression, or schizophrenia were often attributed to demonic possession or moral failing. Treatments included exorcisms, prayers, or even imprisonment. There was little compassion or effective intervention for the mentally ill. Injuries, sustained in daily life, or warfare were perilous. Simple wounds could become infected and gangrenous. Amputations were sometimes necessary, but crude. The risk of dying from infection was high, and recovery was difficult without proper nutrition or care. Nutrition played a critical role in health. The medieval diet, especially for peasants, was deficient in many essential nutrients. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals led to conditions like scurvy and rickets, weakening the population further. Poor dental hygiene caused tooth decay and loss, complicating eating and health. Medical knowledge slowly evolved through the centuries, influenced by Arabic scholars who preserved and expanded upon classical Greek and Roman texts. Physicians like Avicenna and Hippocrates were studied in medieval universities, but practical application was limited. Many practitioners were untrained or relied on superstition. Even with the best care available, surviving a serious illness or injury was uncertain. For the average medieval person, falling sick often meant facing the end alone, with little chance of recovery. The brutality of medieval medicine, combined with the harsh living conditions, made surviving even a single day a feat. In the following section, we will explore medieval food, diet, and nutrition in more depth, how what people ate influenced their health and survival chances. We will also look at how famine and food shortages added to the lethal environment of medieval life. In medieval times, food was far from the abundant and varied fare we enjoy today. What people ate, and more importantly, what they didn't eat, had a profound impact on their health, resilience, and chances of survival. The medieval diet was shaped by geography, social class, agricultural practices, seasons, and the ever-present threat of famine. For the majority of the population, particularly peasants and laborers, food scarcity was a constant concern. The staple food for most was bread, often coarse and dark, made from rye, barley, or oats, which were easier to grow in less fertile soils. Wheat, which produces the white bread associated with wealth and privilege, was expensive and less accessible to common folk. Bread was eaten at every meal, often supplemented by pottage, a thick soup or stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally bits of meat or fish when available. Vegetables and legumes such as beans, peas, onions, cabbage, and leeks were common, though their nutritional value varied depending on freshness and preparation. Fruit was seasonal and often dried or preserved for winter use, but fresh fruit was a rare treat for many. Dairy products like cheese and butter were staples, but varied widely by region and wealth. Meat consumption was a luxury for peasants. Hunting was restricted by laws protecting noble game, and livestock was often reserved for breeding or sold to generate income. When meat was eaten, it was usually pork, poultry, or small game, while beef was rarer. Fish was more accessible in coastal or riverine communities, and was particularly important during religious fasting days when meat consumption was forbidden. The Church played a significant role in regulating food consumption. Religious fasting and abstinence from meat on specific days shaped dietary habits. Fish became a critical source of protein during these periods, leading to the establishment of fish markets and trade routes dedicated to salted or smoked fish preservation. Despite this variety, the medieval diet was often deficient in essential nutrients. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to widespread health problems. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was a chronic issue, especially during winters and famines when fresh produce was scarce. Symptoms included bleeding gums, fatigue, and joint pain, weakening individuals and increasing susceptibility to disease. Malnutrition also made people more vulnerable to infections. The immune system requires adequate nutrients to fight pathogens, and the poor diet of many medieval people compromised this defense. This reality partly explains why diseases like the plague were so devastating. Those already weakened by hunger and poor nutrition stood little chance. Famine was a recurring and terrifying reality throughout medieval Europe. Crop failures caused by bad weather, pestilence, or war could wipe out entire harvests, leading to widespread starvation. Famine years were marked by desperate measures: eating roots, bark, or even dirt, selling possessions and livestock, and increased mortality rates. During these times, social order often broke down, with theft, violence, and migration becoming common. Agricultural practices themselves were primitive by modern standards. The three-field system rotating crops to allow some land to rest was an innovation that improved yields, but still depended heavily on climate and soil conditions. Plows were wooden or iron-tipped, and labor was manual and exhausting. Without fertilizers or pest control, yields were unpredictable, making the population vulnerable to food shortages. Storage of food was another challenge. Grain needed to be protected from rodents, mold, and damp. Poor storage could mean spoilage and loss, exacerbating hunger in lean times. Salt was a valuable commodity for preserving meat and fish, but was costly, limiting its use for many. Trade helped mitigate some regional shortages. Markets and fairs were hubs where goods like spices, sugar, and preserved foods were exchanged. However, these luxuries were primarily available to the wealthy. The poor were largely dependent on local production and seasonal availability. Culinary techniques were simple. Boiling, roasting, and baking were the main cooking methods. Spices, such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, were imported from Asia and highly prized for masking the taste of less fresh food. Medieval cookbooks, often written for noble households, reveal a taste for strong flavors and elaborate preparation. But these recipes were out of reach for commoners. Drinking water quality was generally poor, contaminated by human and animal waste, leading to diseases like dysentery and cholera. Beer and ale were often safer alternatives, especially for peasants. These drinks were weaker than modern versions, but provided calories and some nutrition. Wine was consumed mainly by the wealthy and in southern Europe. Given these conditions, surviving on a medieval diet was a daily struggle. Hunger, malnutrition, and disease were intertwined in a vicious cycle. The food people ate was never guaranteed to sustain them fully, making every meal a matter of life and death. In the next section, we will explore the social and political turmoil of the medieval period, including warfare, lawlessness, and how these factors further endangered survival. We will see how violence, feudal conflicts, and the constant threat of raids or battles shaped everyday existence. The nature of medieval warfare was unlike anything familiar to modern readers. Battles were brutal and short but devastating, with little regard for human life. Armies were composed not only of knights in shining armor, but also a large number of foot soldiers, often peasants, conscripted, or forced into service. These men were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and faced overwhelming odds against more experienced combatants. The casualties were enormous, with wounded soldiers often left to die on the battlefield, as medical knowledge was primitive and battlefield care minimal. Sieges were even more catastrophic. When a castle or fortified town was besieged, the inhabitants faced starvation, disease, and psychological torment. Food and water supplies dwindled quickly, forcing desperate measures such as eating horses, rats, or even their own pets. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions behind castle walls, and once the defenders were weakened, the attackers often resorted to massacres and pillaging. Feudal lords relied heavily on their vassals for military service, but loyalties were fickle and often changed with shifting political alliances or personal gain. This lack of centralized control made prolonged peace rare. Lords constantly jockeyed for power and territory, sometimes switching sides or betraying allies. The instability bred a culture of fear and suspicion that permeated every level of society. The power dynamics within villages and towns also reflected this instability. Peasants owed rents, taxes, and labor to their lords, who could arbitrarily increase demands or impose new burdens. Failure to comply could lead to eviction, imprisonment, or worse. Many peasants lived in perpetual debt, trapped in a cycle that left them vulnerable to exploitation. Some sought refuge in towns or monasteries, but these places were not always safe havens. Bandits and highwaymen thrived in this environment of disorder. Road travel was fraught with danger, as these outlaws would ambush travelers for money, goods, or even food. Merchant caravans had to hire guards, which increased costs and made goods more expensive for everyone. Villagers living near major trade routes sometimes suffered raids that left their homes and granaries empty. The lack of effective law enforcement meant that justice was often violent and arbitrary. Lords administered their own courts, but these were biased in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Peasants had little recourse against abuse, and punishments were harsh even for minor offenses. Public executions and corporal punishment were common spectacles designed to maintain order through fear. The church's role was complex. On one hand, monasteries offered some relief by providing food, shelter, and medical care to the poor and sick. Monks and nuns preserved knowledge and offered spiritual solace. On the other hand, the church was a major landowner and political player, sometimes complicit in feudal oppression. The Crusades mobilized thousands of knights and soldiers in bloody campaigns that disrupted lives and drained resources. Social unrest erupted periodically in the form of peasant revolts. These uprisings were responses to excessive taxation, poor harvests, or oppression by local lords. The most famous, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, showed how desperate and fed up the lower classes had become. While these revolts sometimes achieved temporary concessions, they were almost always crushed brutally, resulting in executions and harsher controls. Survival in this violent milieu required constant adaptability. Peasants and townsfolk developed networks of mutual aid, relying on family, neighbors, and guilds for protection and support. Building alliances with local lords or clerics could provide some security, but was fraught with risk. Migration was a last resort, but sometimes the only option to escape unendurable conditions. In this relentless cycle of war, exploitation, and survival, the medieval world was a place where few could rest easy. The threat of violence was ever present, shaping every aspect of life. Those who lived through these times often did so by sheer resilience and a willingness to endure hardships that are almost unimaginable today. While the general conditions for medieval women were harsh and restrictive, it is important to remember the wide variation in experiences depending on region, class, and individual circumstances. For example, in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly urban centers, women had more opportunities to engage in commerce and community leadership, albeit often under the shadow of male authority. In towns and cities, women could run inns, bakeries, or textile workshops. The textile industry, especially weaving and spinning wool or flax, was one of the few economic spheres where women's labor was not only accepted but vital. Some women became successful business owners or guild members, inheriting their husbands' shops upon their death or working alongside male relatives. Yet, These gains were fragile guilds, often restricted women's membership, or limited their roles to widowhood or family assistance. Marriage and family structures in the medieval period were complex social institutions that controlled much of women's lives. Marriage was not merely a personal or romantic union, but a transaction that reinforced political, economic, or social alliances. Noble families arranged marriages to consolidate power, secure borders, or increase wealth. Even among common folk, marriages often involved negotiation of dowries and property rights. The church played a strong role in sanctioning marriage, but also imposed rules on consent, age, and fidelity. The daily realities of married life were often grueling. Women bore the primary responsibility for raising children, managing households, and supporting their husbands' work. While men often engaged in hunting, warfare, or politics, women's labor was a constant backbone of medieval economy and society. The domestic space was a site of endless work, from baking bread and brewing ale to tending gardens and caring for livestock. Children, servants, and elderly relatives depended heavily on women's organization and care. Widowhood, while a difficult transition, sometimes offered women a form of agency otherwise denied to them. Widows could inherit property or manage estates, and some even acted as patrons or administrators. However, widows were also vulnerable to social stigma, especially if they remained unmarried or lacked male protectors. The Church's teachings emphasized chastity for widows, pressuring many into convent life or remarriage. Religious life offered an alternative path for some medieval women. Convents provided not only spiritual refuge, but also opportunities for education, leadership, and cultural contribution. Abbesses women who led convents could wield considerable authority over their communities, sometimes rivaling that of secular lords. Many convents became centers of manuscript production, artistic creation, and charitable work. Yet, the Church's overall patriarchal structure limited women's roles and often relegated them to passive or subordinate positions. Education remained largely inaccessible to most women, but some broke through these barriers. Female mystics, writers, and patrons left lasting marks on medieval culture. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen combined spiritual vision with medical knowledge and political influence. Others, like Christine de Pizan, challenged prevailing ideas about women's nature and rights through writing. These exceptional women provide glimpses into the possibilities and contradictions of medieval womanhood. Violence against women was a grim reality that permeated medieval life. Legal systems often failed to protect women from abuse or exploitation. Domestic violence was rarely prosecuted, and social norms frequently blamed victims rather than perpetrators. Sexual violence during warfare raids, sieges, or mercenary attacks added another layer of terror. Women faced threats not only from strangers, but from family members or local authorities abusing their power. The widespread fear of witchcraft reflected broader anxieties about women's roles and independence. Accusations of witchcraft disproportionately targeted women, especially those who were poor, widowed, or socially marginalized. Trials often involved torture and led to executions, reinforcing social control through fear. This persecution reveals the intersection of gender, power, and superstition in medieval societies. Despite these dangers, medieval women displayed remarkable resilience. They cultivated community networks, passed down practical knowledge, and found ways to assert influence within constrained roles. Their stories remind us that survival in medieval times was not only about enduring physical hardship, but also negotiating social expectations and asserting human dignity in a restrictive world. In summary, medieval women's lives were shaped by a complex interplay of oppression, labor, resilience, and limited empowerment. Their experiences highlight the gendered dimensions of survival during one of history's most difficult periods. To fully understand medieval times, we must listen to these voices and recognize their struggles and contributions. The peasant's existence was tightly woven into the rhythms of the natural world and the agricultural calendar, a relentless cycle that left little room for rest or leisure. Seasons dictated every action, from the harsh planting in spring, the exhausting summer tending of crops, to the frenzied harvest in autumn, and the bleak, idle winter months. Springtime brought hope, but also backbreaking labor. Fields had to be plowed deep and evenly, often using primitive wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. Peasants labored shoulder to shoulder, hands raw from digging in cold soil, their clothes tattered and shoes patched from years of wear. The success of the harvest, and thus their survival, depended on this early work. Any delay or poor weather could doom crops to failure. Summer required constant vigilance. Weeds threatened to choke the crops. Pests, birds, and livestock needed to be kept away. Women and children played critical roles here, pulling weeds, gathering eggs, and milking animals. The midday sun was brutal, and many peasants worked through exhaustion. Yet meals were small and infrequent, often just coarse bread, dipped in water or thin gruel. Harvest was the most critical and intense season, demanding all hands. Families and neighbors would come together for the communal effort known as the gleaning. This was both a necessity and a rare social event, yet it was governed by strict rules to ensure the Lord's share was protected. After the Lord's portion was delivered, peasants could gather leftover crops to feed their families. But the bounty was never guaranteed. A bad harvest could mean famine and death. Winter was a time of hardship and scarcity. Food stocks dwindled, and the cold penetrated thin, drafty homes. Without modern heating, families huddled around a small fire, trying to conserve warmth. Illnesses spread easily, as cold and malnutrition weakened immune systems. Work slowed, but not entirely stopped animal care, and tool maintenance occupied the remaining daylight. Peasant diets reflected their limited means and seasonal availability. Bread made from barley or rye, which were cheaper and more resilient grains than wheat, was the staple. Vegetables like onions, cabbage, and beans were cultivated in small garden plots. Dairy products, eggs, and occasionally small game or fish supplemented meals. But meat was a luxury rarely afforded. This lack of protein led to nutritional deficiencies and weakened health, exacerbating the impact of diseases. Healthcare was rudimentary at best. Medical knowledge was a mixture of folk remedies, superstition, and religious faith. When illness struck, herbal treatments and prayers were the main tools available. Midwives attended births, often drawing on generations of passed-down wisdom, but complications could be fatal. Epidemics, such as the bubonic plague, swept through villages with devastating speed, killing whole families. The social hierarchy imposed on peasants was reinforced by a complex web of duties and obligations. They owed labor services to the Lord, which might include working his fields, repairing roads, or maintaining fortifications. These unpaid labors were often a source of resentment and could sap time and energy from tending their own plots. Taxes came in many forms: produce, money, or military service. Some peasants paid tithes to the church, adding another financial burden. Failure to meet these obligations could lead to penalties or eviction, pushing families into destitution. Many peasants lived with constant anxiety over these demands, which could shift with political changes or local lords' whims. Despite these severe limitations, medieval peasants cultivated a strong sense of community and solidarity. Mutual aid was a survival strategy. Villagers shared resources, helped each other during illnesses, and cooperated during labor-intensive seasons. Social events, religious festivals, and market days were vital opportunities for connection and emotional relief from hardship. Women in peasant communities bore a disproportionate share of labor, balancing farm work with household management and child rearing. Their contributions were essential, but often unrecognized in official records. Women also played roles in local economies, selling surplus produce, brewing ale, or weaving cloth. Their skills ensured the family's survival and economic resilience. Children were introduced early to the demands of peasant life. From a young age, they helped with chores, learned farming techniques, and absorbed the oral traditions and customs of their communities. Education was informal and focused on practical knowledge needed to continue the cycle of labor and survival. Legal rights for peasants were minimal. Lords held judicial power over their tenants, presiding over disputes and meting out punishments. Peasants had little recourse in the face of injustice, and accusations of theft or rebellion could lead to harsh consequences. Nevertheless, peasants sometimes organized small revolts or negotiated for better terms, especially during times of crisis. The Black Death in the mid-14th century was a turning point for many peasants. The massive reduction in population led to labor shortages, which increased bargaining power for surviving workers. Some serfs gained freedoms, wages rose, and feudal obligations lessened in certain regions. However, these gains were uneven and often met with resistance by the nobility. In sum, peasant life in medieval times was a relentless struggle against environmental, economic, and social hardships. Their survival depended on endurance, adaptability, and community support amid constant threats. Their stories reveal why lasting even a day in medieval society was layered with complex hierarchies, and survival depended not only on enduring daily hardships, but also on navigating the intricate social, political, and economic structures of the time. Understanding how medieval people, especially commoners, faced these challenges reveals why surviving even a single day required more than mere luck. It demanded constant vigilance, resilience, and adaptability. Life in medieval times was shaped profoundly by the feudal system, a rigid social order that tied peasants, knights, clergy, and nobility together in a web of mutual obligations and control. At the bottom of this structure were peasants, many of whom were serfs, bound to the land and obligated to serve their lord. Unlike free tenants, serfs had limited personal freedom, and their fate was inseparable from that of the manor they lived on. The manor was the economic and social heart of medieval rural life. It consisted of the lord's estate and the surrounding peasant lands. While the lord's manor house or castle symbolized power and privilege, peasants lived in small, cramped huts on the manor's outskirts, their lives dictated by the demands of agriculture and servitude. Daily life for these peasants was a cycle of hard labor, dictated by the seasons and the lord's requirements. From dawn to dusk, peasants worked tirelessly, plowing fields, planting seeds, tending livestock, and harvesting crops. This labor was often shared communally, reinforcing social bonds, but it was also a necessity for survival. The lord's demands were unrelenting. Peasants owed various forms of service corvée labor on the lord's domain, payment of rents and crops or money, and taxes to both the lord and the church. These obligations could be oppressive, leaving peasants with little time or resources to improve their own living conditions. The Lord's court administered justice and could impose harsh penalties, ensuring control and order. Yet, despite their lowly status, peasants were not entirely powerless. Communities formed tight-knit villages where cooperation and mutual aid were essential. Shared labor during harvests, collective maintenance of common lands, and communal celebrations provided moments of respite from the rigors of daily life. Religious festivals and holy days offered spiritual comfort and social cohesion, anchoring the community in a shared cultural and faith-based identity. The church played a central role in medieval life, influencing not only spiritual beliefs, but also social norms and education. Parish churches were often the sole public buildings in rural areas, serving as centers of worship, learning, and social interaction. Clergy could act as intermediaries between peasants and the broader world, sometimes advocating for their needs or providing charity. Medieval healthcare was rudimentary and often intertwined with superstition. Illness was frequently seen as a punishment from God or caused by evil spirits. Remedies ranged from herbal treatments and prayers to more extreme practices like bloodletting. Epidemics, such as the Black Death, devastated populations, striking down peasants who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The psychological impact of such widespread death was profound, reinforcing a sense of fragility and the ever-present threat of mortality. Violence was another harsh reality. The medieval period was marked by frequent local conflicts, feudal skirmishes, and lawlessness. Peasants could find themselves caught in the crossfire between rival lords, or suffering from raids by bandits. The lack of a centralized police force meant that personal security was often dependent on the lord's protection or community solidarity. Despite these hardships, medieval people developed coping mechanisms and strategies for survival. Craftsmanship and trade offered some avenues for economic advancement, especially in growing towns and cities. Guilds regulated trades and provided social support to their members. For some, military service or the church offered a path to higher status. Education was limited primarily to the clergy and nobility, but the gradual rise of universities and urban literacy began to change this dynamic in later medieval centuries. For peasants, oral tradition preserved history, folklore, and practical knowledge, creating a rich cultural tapestry despite the lack of formal schooling. Women's roles in medieval society were multifaceted and essential to survival. While often constrained by social norms and legal limitations, women managed households, worked fields, cared for children, and contributed to local economies through crafts and market activities. Some women in religious orders attained education and influence, otherwise inaccessible. In summary, surviving in medieval times required navigating a world fraught with physical danger, economic exploitation, social hierarchy, and spiritual uncertainty. The resilience and ingenuity of medieval people in the face of these challenges reveal a human story of endurance that often goes untold beneath the grand narratives of kings and battles. One of the most relentless challenges in medieval times was the threat of famine. The agricultural system was highly dependent on weather patterns, and a single poor harvest could plunge entire regions into starvation. Unlike today's complex food distribution networks, medieval communities relied almost exclusively on local production. When drought, floods, or pests destroyed crops, peasants were left with little to eat. Famine was not just a matter of hunger. It weakened the body's defenses, making people more vulnerable to disease. Starvation slowed healing and reduced energy, leaving individuals unable to perform essential labor. It also heightened social tensions. Desperate people might steal or revolt, and lords could respond with brutal repression. The medieval calendar was punctuated by periods of scarcity. The late Middle Ages, particularly the 14th century, saw recurrent famines exacerbated by the Little Ice Age, a climatic downturn that shortened growing seasons and caused crop failures. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 was one of the most devastating, with widespread hunger, soaring grain prices, and increased mortality. This famine weakened populations just before the arrival of the Black Death, compounding the crisis. In this unforgiving environment, the medieval diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Bread made from rye or barley, peas, beans, and onions formed the staple fare. Meat was largely reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Fish was consumed where available, but was less common inland. The absence of essential vitamins led to diseases like scurvy and rickets. Beyond hunger, the living conditions themselves facilitated the spread of disease. Villages were often cramped, with houses built close together, sharing limited water sources. The disposal of human and animal waste was poorly managed. Open sewers or cesspits contaminated drinking water, breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and other illnesses. Flies and rats thrived in these conditions, vectors for disease transmission. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, illustrated the devastating impact of medieval public health failures. The plague spread rapidly along trade routes, decimating populations and causing widespread panic. Estimates suggest that between 30 to 60% of Europe's population perished in just a few years. The psychological impact was immense, shaking faith in institutions and altering social structures. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and medieval physicians had few effective treatments. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, dominated medical thinking, leading to practices like bloodletting that often harmed patients. Surgery was risky and painful, performed without anesthesia or sterilization. The Church's role in medicine was complex. Monasteries preserved medical texts and provided care, but many treatments relied on superstition or religious rituals. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were common as people sought divine intervention for healing. Violence and insecurity compounded the harshness of medieval life. The absence of centralized law enforcement meant that banditry and feuds were common. Lords maintained private armies, and peasants could be drawn into conflicts not of their making. Warfare devastated lands, destroyed crops, and displaced populations. Justice was often harsh and arbitrary. Trials by ordeal, public executions, and corporal punishment were routine. The threat of punishment enforced social order, but added to the daily anxieties of common folk. Despite these hardships, medieval society was not static. Towns and cities grew, fueled by trade and craft production. Markets connected rural producers to urban consumers, creating new economic opportunities. Guilds regulated trades, ensuring quality and protecting members. This urbanization gradually shifted social dynamics, offering alternatives to the feudal system. Education and literacy slowly expanded, with universities emerging as centers of learning. While peasants remained largely uneducated, the broader cultural landscape began to change, laying groundwork for future societal transformations. Women's experiences were varied and often underrepresented in historical accounts. While constrained by patriarchal norms, women contributed significantly to family economies and community life. Some gained independence as widows, merchants, or members of religious orders. Their labor in agriculture, textiles, and markets was indispensable. Religious life permeated all levels of medieval society. The Church's teachings shaped moral values, social behavior, and worldviews. Religious festivals and rituals provided community cohesion and hope amid adversity. Clergy wielded considerable influence, sometimes acting as advocates or sources of charity. Ultimately, surviving in medieval times required more than physical endurance. It demanded navigating a complex web of social, economic, and spiritual realities. The resilience of medieval people in the face of such overwhelming challenges is a testament to human adaptability and strength. The medieval world was a complex and unforgiving landscape, a place where the basic act of surviving even a single day required a blend of physical endurance, mental fortitude, and social navigation. As we reach the concluding chapter of this deep dive into the brutal realities of medieval life, it is essential to reflect on why many would not last even 24 hours in that era. The harshness of the times, the scarcity of resources, and the ever-present dangers created a relentless pressure on every individual, shaping a way of life that is both alien and illuminating to us today. One of the most striking aspects of medieval existence was the fragile relationship between humans and their environment. The majority of the population depended on agriculture, and the success or failure of crops could mean the difference between feast and famine. Medieval farming techniques were rudimentary. Without modern machinery, fertilizers, or pest control, peasants worked the land with simple tools and sheer muscle. The seasons dictated their labor: sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and survival in winter. Each phase brought its own dangers. Spring frost could destroy young plants, summer droughts wither fields, autumn rains rot the harvest, and winter starvation stalked the cold months. Compounding these difficulties was the unpredictability of weather. Medieval climate fluctuations, including periods known as the Little Ice Age, brought colder temperatures and shortened growing seasons. This environmental instability often resulted in widespread crop failures, leading to famines that devastated communities. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, killed millions across Europe and exposed the vulnerability of medieval society to natural calamities. Food scarcity wasn't the only challenge. The medieval diet, though varying by social class, was largely monotonous and nutritionally insufficient. Peasants subsisted mainly on bread made from rye or barley, porridge, legumes, and whatever vegetables were available. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or special occasions, and even then, it was often salted or dried to preserve it. Malnutrition was common, weakening immune systems and making people susceptible to disease. Children especially faced high mortality rates, with many dying before their 5th birthday due to lack of proper nutrition and hygiene. Disease was one of the most fearsome enemies of medieval people. Without understanding of germs or sanitation, illnesses spread rapidly through overcrowded villages and towns. Epidemics, such as the Black Death, wiped out entire populations in a matter of years. This bubonic plague pandemic of the mid-14th century killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, leaving a lasting impact on society and economy. Other diseases like leprosy, smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery were constant threats. Medical knowledge was primitive, often relying on superstition, herbal remedies, and the spiritual intercession of clergy. The absence of effective treatments and proper hygiene ensured that minor injuries and infections could become fatal. The harshness of medieval justice and governance further complicated survival. Feudal lords held immense power over their subjects, and laws were enforced with brutal punishments. Crimes, whether real or perceived, were often met with harsh penalties: flogging, mutilation, or execution. The judicial process lacked fairness by modern standards. Accusations could be based on hearsay, and trials often favored the powerful. The Church, too, played a significant role in law enforcement, particularly concerning moral offenses and heresy. Witch hunts and inquisitions created a climate of fear, where suspicion could lead to imprisonment or death. Social stratification was rigid, and mobility was limited. Serfs were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without permission. Their lives were tied to the whims of their lord, who controlled the land and the resources. The peasant class bore heavy tax burdens and labor obligations, such as working the lord's domain fields and providing services. In return, they received protection and a small plot of land for subsistence farming. This system entrenched poverty and dependence, making survival a daily struggle for the majority. Violence was ever present, both from external invasions and internal conflicts. The medieval period was marked by constant warfare between kingdoms, within feudal territories, and against invading groups such as Vikings, Magyars, or later, the Ottoman Turks. Castles and fortified towns served as defense mechanisms, but sieges brought starvation and death to civilians trapped inside. Raids and banditry were common, especially in borderlands or lawless regions. Peasants often had to defend themselves or flee, adding insecurity to their already precarious existence. Despite these overwhelming hardships, medieval people created communities rich in culture and resilience. Religious faith was a central pillar, offering hope and meaning amid suffering. Churches and monasteries were centers of learning, charity, and social life. Festivals and holy days punctuated the calendar, providing respite and celebration. Artisans and traders slowly transformed economies, and the gradual emergence of towns introduced new opportunities and challenges. Education was limited, mostly confined to clergy and nobility, but the preservation of classical knowledge and the rise of universities set the stage for future progress. Literature, music, and art flourished in their own ways, reflecting the complexity of medieval society. The period was not just one of darkness and despair, but also one of endurance, adaptation, and incremental change. In the end, understanding why one wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval times is not just about listing hardships. It is about appreciating the relentless nature of that world and the remarkable strength of those who lived through it. Their stories remind us of the fragility of life, the importance of community, and the human capacity to persevere against the odds. While we may find comfort in modern medicine, technology, and social structures, looking back at medieval survival challenges us to recognize the roots of our civilization and the incredible journey humanity has undertaken. The medieval era stands as one of the most challenging epochs in human history. The struggles faced by individuals during this time were manifold and intertwined, forming a harsh reality that few today can truly imagine. As we move into this next exploration, it's essential to peel back the layers further and understand not just the surface hardships, but the intricate social, economic, environmental, and psychological pressures that shaped medieval survival. To grasp why surviving even a short time was a monumental challenge, we must dive deep into the fabric of medieval society, the forces that dictated life and death, and the complex web of relationships and conditions that defined the era. The very foundation of medieval life was the agrarian economy, a system utterly dependent on the land and the seasons. Unlike our modern, interconnected world where food is shipped globally year-round, medieval peasants and farmers were at the mercy of their local environment. The land had to provide all sustenance, and poor soil quality, unpredictable weather, and limited technology meant that yields were often minimal and precarious. Crop rotation systems, while used, were still primitive, and pests or diseases could wipe out a harvest in weeks. The entire community's survival hinged on the success of these harvests. The cycles of sowing and reaping were relentless. From the break of dawn to dusk, peasants worked tirelessly with simple tools like wooden plows, sickles, and hoes. There was no respite in times of hardship. Drought, flood, or early frost could spell doom. Malnutrition was common, weakening bodies and minds, making illness more likely and recovery slower. Children were especially vulnerable, and high infant and child mortality rates were the tragic norm. Beyond food scarcity, medieval people faced an unending barrage of diseases. The absence of clean water and sanitation systems created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Contaminated wells and latrines close to living spaces spread cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. The understanding of disease transmission was non-existent, so remedies were often superstitious or misguided. Healing practices relied heavily on religious rituals, herbal concoctions, and folk medicine, but few treatments were truly effective. Epidemics like the bubonic plague, influenza, and smallpox decimated populations with terrifying speed. Living conditions added to these risks. Homes were small, often 1 or 2 roomed, built from wood or wattle and daub, poorly insulated against cold or dampness. Hearth fires provided some warmth, but also smoke, which could cause respiratory issues. Close quarters meant that diseases spread rapidly among families and neighbors. Personal hygiene was limited by water availability and cultural practices. Bathing was infrequent, and clothing was rarely washed. The social hierarchy also imposed heavy burdens. The feudal system tied peasants to their lord's land, demanding taxes, labor, and obedience in exchange for protection. This relationship was unequal and exploitative, with lords often extracting the maximum possible resources from their tenants. Peasants had little legal recourse and were subject to arbitrary justice. Failure to meet obligations could result in fines, imprisonment, or loss of land. The specter of starvation loomed if any disruption occurred in this fragile economic balance. Moreover, medieval law enforcement was harsh and often cruel. Punishments for even minor infractions could be severe, including public humiliation, corporal punishment, or execution. The Church's influence extended into judicial matters, prosecuting moral offenses and heresy with zeal. This created a climate of fear, where accusations could ruin lives, and the marginalized were especially vulnerable. Conflict and warfare further endangered medieval life. Feudal lords waged constant local battles for territory and power, while invasions by foreign armies brought destruction. Castles and fortified towns were centers of defense, but also traps during sieges, where starvation and disease were common. The presence of armed knights, mercenaries, and bandits made travel dangerous. Ordinary people could be caught in the crossfire or targeted by marauders, with little hope for protection. Despite these grim realities, medieval communities exhibited resilience. The Church, while an instrument of control, was also a source of social support, charity, and spiritual comfort. Religious festivals, pilgrimages, and rituals offered moments of joy and communal identity. Monasteries preserved knowledge and education, slowly nurturing the seeds of intellectual growth. Art, music, and storytelling thrived in their own spheres, expressing the hopes, fears, and values of the time. Trade and urban growth introduced new dynamics. Markets and fairs connected distant regions, bringing goods, ideas, and opportunities. Guilds formed to protect craftsmen and merchants, while towns began to develop self-governance. This gradual shift challenged the old feudal order and laid the foundation for modern society. Surviving in medieval times meant navigating a world fraught with danger and uncertainty. It demanded physical strength, adaptability, social cunning, and above all, hope. The people who lived through these centuries were shaped by their environment, their beliefs, and the relentless challenges they faced. Understanding their world not only deepens our appreciation of history, but also illuminates the enduring human spirit. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the brutal realities of medieval life and why surviving even a single day was an immense challenge, it is crucial to reflect deeply on the societal structures, beliefs, and transformations that defined this era. The medieval period was not merely a sequence of hardships, but a complex tapestry woven with resilience, faith, innovation, and gradual change. In this concluding part, we'll journey through the enduring legacies of medieval survival, the slow dawn of new eras, and the lessons that resonate across centuries. Life in medieval times was shaped by a persistent tension between order and chaos. The feudal system imposed a rigid hierarchy that governed land, labor, and allegiance. Yet beneath this order lay the unpredictability of nature, disease, and conflict. Peasants, knights, clergy, and nobles alike lived within this fragile balance, each class facing unique trials, but collectively part of a world where death was ever present and survival was a daily accomplishment. The peasantry, making up the vast majority, endured the most grueling hardships. Bound to the land, their lives revolved around the seasons and the dictates of their lords. They labored from dawn to dusk, cultivating fields with primitive tools, enduring harsh weather and poor nutrition. The constant threat of famine, epidemics, and punitive justice weighed heavily on them. Despite these challenges, peasant communities forged strong social bonds, relying on shared labor, mutual aid, and religious faith to persevere. For the nobility and knights, medieval survival meant managing their estates, maintaining military readiness, and navigating intricate political alliances. Castles served as defensive bastions, but also as symbols of power and control. Warfare was frequent and brutal, from local skirmishes to large-scale crusades, and the risks extended to common folk caught in the turmoil. The code of chivalry, though idealized, often masked the harsh realities of feudal violence and social inequality. The Church was a central force, influencing nearly every aspect of life. It offered spiritual solace and social services, but also wielded tremendous political power. Monasteries preserved knowledge through manuscript copying and scholarship, becoming centers of learning amidst widespread illiteracy. The Church's teachings shaped morality, law, and culture, providing a framework through which people interpreted their suffering and hopes. Despite the darkness often associated with the medieval era, it was also a time of remarkable cultural and technological development. Innovations in agriculture, such as the heavy plow and three-field system, gradually improved productivity. The rise of towns and trade introduced new economic opportunities and social mobility. Gothic architecture and medieval art showcased intricate craftsmanship and profound religious devotion. Medieval medicine, though primitive, was an evolving field influenced by classical texts and Islamic scholarship. While many treatments were ineffective or harmful by modern standards, the pursuit of healing reflected a deep human desire to overcome suffering. The eventual questioning of traditional authority and the dawn of the Renaissance signaled the beginning of profound transformations that would reshape Europe. The constant presence of death shaped medieval attitudes toward life, spirituality, and community. Rituals surrounding birth, marriage, and burial underscored the cyclical nature of existence. Festivals and holidays punctuated the calendar, providing relief from daily toil and reinforcing communal identity. Storytelling, music, and art conveyed the values and struggles of the time, preserving a rich cultural heritage. As we conclude this extensive journey through medieval survival, it is evident that the period was far more than a backdrop of misery. It was a dynamic era where human resilience, creativity, and faith flourished amidst adversity. The challenges were immense, and many did not survive the harsh conditions. Yet those who did laid the foundations for the modern world. Understanding medieval life invites us to appreciate the progress we often take for granted. Access to food, medicine, education, and justice has dramatically improved. But the medieval experience reminds us of the fragility of human existence and the enduring strength required to face uncertainty. In reflecting on why one wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval times, we honor the memory of countless individuals whose stories have shaped history. Their struggles, sacrifices, and triumphs continue to inspire us, offering lessons in perseverance, community, and hope.